This is why I think a lot of companies don't put their bandings public, because they ultimately want to save money, they want to kind of negotiate people down, but also it lets people kind of negotiate upwards as well.
When you think about pay transparency, what do you think have been the impacts on your candidate funnel?
We do probably get less applications. We don't drop in quality, we don't drop in relevance. So that's kind of fantastic at the first stage. We can explain on the first call with the candidate what we pay, why we pay it, how we determine how much we're going to pay that person, and they can make a decision, say, okay, I want to move forwards or not, knowing that their interview performance will be the basis of their salary offer at the end of the process.
What recommendations would you give to a candidate to kind of make sure they fully understand, the compensation philosophy of their business and how they're going to be paid?
This is why I think a lot of companies don't put their bandings public, because they ultimately want to save money, they want to kind of negotiate people down, but also it lets people kind of negotiate upwards as well.
When you think about pay transparency, what do you think have been the impacts on your candidate funnel?
We do probably get less applications. We don't drop in quality, we don't drop in relevance. So that's kind of fantastic at the first stage. We can explain on the first call with the candidate what we pay, why we pay it, how we determine how much we're going to pay that person, and they can make a decision, say, okay, I want to move forwards or not, knowing that their interview performance will be the basis of their salary offer at the end of the process.
What recommendations would you give to a candidate to kind of make sure they fully understand, the compensation philosophy of their business and how they're going to be paid? Hello and welcome to the Open to Work podcast. We've got a really interesting episode in the books today. So I'm joined by Luke Victor, the Head of Talent Acquisition at Cleo. Luke, welcome.
Great. Well, thanks for the intro, Matt. Great to be here. Really excited to talk about something that's very close to my heart, which is pay transparency, kind of general transparency around kind of interviewing in general. Bit of background on me. So yeah, as Matthew said, so I head up the talent team at Cleo. If you don't know anything about us, do give us a Google. We're a kind of AI financial advisor that kind of help people manage their money and build financial literacy. So all the sexy buzzwords at the moment. I've been in recruitment for 8-9 years now. Kind of started out in agency, worked in a bit of exec search, then kind of moved into startups, initially kind of very much focused on tech recruitment, before moving into a slightly broader kind of managerial role, overseeing kind of all talent at Cleo at the moment. And yeah, that's a bit about me.
Nice. So to kick us off with then, talk to me a bit about the kind of what was happening behind the scenes and paint a bit of a story behind the conversations that were happening in regards to like kind of going public, I guess, with your pay philosophy and your broader pay transparency approach.
It's a great question. I'll answer as much as I can, because ultimately the decision to implement pay transparency at Cleo did happen slightly before I joined, but I have the context and I know why it happened, and it's something that, again, I very much agree with. Transparency at Cleo is kind of almost one of our core values. I mean, actually, one of our core values is no bullshit, but that is kind of transcribed into transparency in every capacity. For us, though, the decision to kind of make pay transparent was done in tandem with putting out public progression frameworks and transparency around interview processes. And it was really just to kind of, I think, arrest the slide of kind of bad interviewing practices that we've seen happen quite a lot around the market, and people kind of being put into processes where they don't really understand what they're getting themselves into, and then they either drop out at the last minute or they take a job and they're not happy with it. So for us, pay transparency was one of the easiest decisions, just to kind of say, this is the benchmark, this is the banding that we're looking to hire into. If you're interested, then this is what to expect. And there's so many benefits of it. There's so many things that have kind of come good off the back of it that I don't think we initially thought about, around retention, around gender pay gap, around kind of the recruitment efficiencies. But ultimately, it lets people know what they're getting themselves into, and make a decision as to whether they want to proceed or not. And I think everyone would love to say, I want to go work for somewhere because I love the company or I love the job role, but we all have bills to pay, and you can't pay your bills with love for the job, unfortunately.
Yeah, for sure. And so how big were you as an employee size, when you decided to make this shift?
Relatively small, about 150 or so. So obviously it was a bit simpler to do then, because, we only had a set amount of job functions, and therefore we were able to benchmark against all of them and have those in place. But most companies will have salary benchmarks for different job levels and different job roles. Whether they stick to them or not is a different question. But all we did is publish those.
Mm-hmm.
We've not kind of fudged the numbers in the slightest. We use different salary benchmarking tools and companies. They give us the benchmark. We decide how much of the benchmark we want to pay, and then we put it out into the world, and people can know that. Hence why whenever you see a benchmark from Cleo, it won't be £60,000, it'll be 61,386 or something. It's very exact science and maths.
Mm-hmm. And so maybe explain to kind of people at home how you come up, and maybe we need to get a compensation specialist on, but to the best of your knowledge, how do you come up with that number? What's the process behind the scenes?
Yeah, of course. So as I said, we use a couple of different kind of salary benchmarking tools. So you've got Pave and Ravio and a few others, and we basically pay them for data. They'll come back to us with different kind of job roles and levels and what the benchmarks is based on different companies of similar sizes across similar locations. We then map out those jobs to what we do. It without sounding kind of super arrogant, what a software engineer at Cleo does is not necessarily going to be what a software engineer at another company does, and so on for all of the job roles. So there is a little bit of nuance there in actually understanding the scope of what you're asking people to do. But then you've got the job role mapped out and the progression frameworks and everything like that. You've got the rough salary that the market should be paying, and then we have to decide where within the band we want to pay. And for us, the decision was made to basically pay 75th percentile of the market. So we want to be in the top 25% of payers, basically, or the 25th percent. And that was decided so we can get good people, we can get great people for that money, but also compensating for the fact that we're a relatively small company. We don't have the financial backing of a Google or a Meta to be able to kind of go out and pay top end of the ranges for everyone. But that's where it kind of settled on, and then we had basically a decision around how far do we stretch that band? What's the lowest end of it? What's the top end of that? What gives us enough money to play with and enough kind of progression within that banding. Rule of thumb, I think we try and have about between 10 and 20 grand within a band. So it's not like one promotion and you suddenly go from, or one pay rise and you go from bottom of the band to top of the band. But also it's not an insurmountable distance that it's going to take 3 years to move up through.
Mm-hmm. And so just, I guess, to kind of walk through an example. So if you're, let's say, your data is indicating that the kind of 100% of the band, the top end of the band is 100K, let's say, and you're paying 75th percentile, your band will probably be somewhere between kind of 60 odd to 80 odd within around that band to give you opportunity to flex up, and then also a bit of flexibility underneath it as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
And obviously I'm generalizing, and there'll be lots more specifics that are sitting behind the scenes that Cleo will be doing to kind of think about compensation that is not public information, but this is a really good, I think, understanding of like what is happening behind the scenes, because how do you come up with a salary, right? And I think there's good ways that this happens, and I think from the sounds of it, like Cleo is doing things well and thinking about this really thoughtfully, but there are lots of businesses out there that are still going on, that are hiring manager led, and that are kind of not necessarily quite as structured in how they think about, especially smaller businesses, and how they think about pay.
Yeah, definitely. And it's very easy to kind of just say, finger in the air, this is what I'm going to pay. But ultimately, if you have a hiring manager that came from a big tech company or a big bank who comes to a startup and says, we used to pay this, let's pay that here, it's just not going to work. And I think a lot of places have seen, especially over the last few years, when a lot of companies had to make a lot of layoffs, the biggest cost any company has is the people costs. So there's a real battle to kind of keep that down while also making sure that you're paying enough to get great people. And it's not an exact science. And I'm sure there'll be some people that say there's some of our bandings that aren't quite high enough for what we want, and some that are maybe higher than what we need. And I don't think anyone does it exactly perfectly, because I don't think there's necessarily a perfect science to it. But it's just about taking in as much data as you can and being as objective as you possibly can be as well.
Yeah. And I talk about this like really this kind of important tension that exists between like the compensation mathematics that are happening behind the scenes and like what talent acquisition want. Because like talent acquisition will always want to pay more because it makes our job easier to get the candidate over the line, right? Like so we're naturally incentivized to think that way. And compensation is not trying to get us to pay less, but it's trying to pay us what they think is an appropriate amount of money. And that intention I think is really important. And so if you're a recruiter out there listening, like build a really good relationship with compensation, understand why they're telling you the things they're telling you in regards to comp, because it helps you become a more informed kind of candidate guide.
Absolutely, yeah.
I think what you mentioned at the top of the podcast about that kind of observing that this wasn't done quite right and that there were some bad behaviors that you observed on market. Or that the team was observing on market. Are you able to speak to kind of what you feel were some of the wrong behaviors and how you and why you actively attempted to correct against those?
Yeah, so the big one for me, and this might be sort of super controversial, is always around negotiation. As a recruiter, I hate it, which I know is kind of not what people expect to hear, but this is why I think a lot of companies don't put their bandings public, because they ultimately they want to save money, they want to kind of negotiate people down, but also it lets people kind of negotiate upwards as well. And we say it clear, by and large, unless it's a particular role, we don't negotiate on salaries. We try and give the best and final offer every time within that banding, and we're transparent in the same way of how we can manage the process. Because ultimately, I think unless negotiation is a core aspect of the job we're already interviewing for, it shouldn't be rewarded. And ultimately it is, and that's, I think, why people have the lack of transparency, because it allows for these practices to say, we're going to do what we can to get something to the line. It might mean that we're paying out of band, but it might mean that we're actually paying them below the band. And it's just that lack of transparency, I think it doesn't start the relationship between employee and employer with a lot of trust.
Yeah, I totally agree that the kind of Uber took away some of their like transparencies around like how they pay out their drivers recently, and I remember this kind of causing a big fuss on LinkedIn, and like I think rightly so, right? The only reason why you don't want to be transparent is because you want there to be disparity. You want to benefit of that disparity and lack of information being out in the public market, and I think that's the same with pay. It gives that opportunity for it there to be grey areas which people can then exploit or not be enabled by. Like there's a lot of data to indicate that women negotiate less than men, and so that's drives pay disparity across within certain teams.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, like I don't really see the downside of not being public with these things. It's not exactly like you're going out there and saying, once you're in, this is the promotion criteria framework. This is exactly what you need to say to pass an interview or to get a pay rise. It's just saying, do what you do, be as good as you are, but this is the parameters in which we're working in terms of the compensation.
So Alderson James are one of the leading people and talent agencies. Since 2013, they've been responsible for over 1,000 people and talent hires, including one in a company that I used to work at. They helped me hire my head of technology TA. So I know the guys there pretty well. They've been responsible for scaling some of the most innovative companies in the UK and the EU. Also recently just launched in the US. So even folks in your neck of the woods now, James, can get involved for contingent, retained, and executive search. And they also now do embedded through AJX. So they can do it all. When you think about pay transparency, what do you think have been the impacts on your candidate funnel?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, firstly, people can normally look at it before you apply. So, you save a lot of conversations that you might have with someone where the first question, or not the first question, but, one of the questions to ask on that first call is, what are you looking for? They come back and say, X percent more than what you can pay. And it's like, well, let's shake hands and walk away at that point. So we do probably get less applications, but we don't drop in quality, we don't drop in relevance. So that's kind of fantastic at the first stage. Again, when I speak about it, or I spoke about earlier, starting a relationship with an employer with that high level of trust, you get that through the process too. We can explain on the first call with the candidate what we pay, why we pay it, how we determine how much we're going to pay that person, and they can make a decision to say, okay, I want to move forwards or not. Knowing that their interview performance will be the basis of their salary offer at the end of the process. So we can also get a sense of, someone's rationality and objectivity very early on. As I said, it helps self-selection, because if we feel that someone's, not going to get the level that they want, they can kind of, get out and save time. And then once we get to that offer, it helps with offer negotiations or lack of negotiations, but it helps with the offer management side, because, again, we've been transparent about what we're going to do, so there's no nasty surprises at the end. It helps with closing the gender pay gap as well, because we can say that, this is what we offer everyone that performs at this level, regardless of, who they are or what they've done, because of the rubrics and the guidance that we've built. So yeah, it definitely helps you be a bit more targeted.
Yeah. Do you get, so my guess would be that you would get slightly fewer candidates applying overall. Are you seeing that? Do you think, in comparison to like some of the external data that seems to be out there?
It's really a difficult point to answer that one, because Cleo's got a very good employee brand. We've got some fantastic people that kind of cover that, so we get a lot of applications. I would wager that we'd get more if we didn't have pay transparency, though.
Yeah. And why do you think? Like, so it seems like you've listed out like a load of benefits to pay transparency, right? Like, I'm sold. I was sold before I came into this, but increasingly, I think it's such an important part of how we communicate and engage with candidates, building that mutual trust and respect super early. There's employer brand benefits. Application volumes are as high as they've ever been. There's volumes on recruiter efficiency. There's like a lot of ticks. Yet when you look across the market right now, most of what you see is, what are your salary expectations, in a box that's basically open to be filled in whichever way you want, as a question in a form. And that's how most companies deal with pay at the moment, at the top of funnel. Why do you think that there's this disconnect with how beneficial it is and the reality of why so few companies are delivering this on market?
It's hard to say. My gut feel is that it's a lot of work to do it. It's a lot of work. It's not a lot of work once it's in place, but to get it set up, it takes a lot of work to do, because it's not just about having a banding that you work within. It's about then having the rationale to explain why you're using that banding. And so alongside the public banding, you also need progression frameworks. You need to have something in place to say, if you're coming in as a financial analyst, what is a junior expected to do? What's a mid-level, a senior, a principal, etc.? What do all of these job levels have to do in terms of skills, behaviours, and so on? What do we then pay them? And then you use that in the terms of the interview process, because you can say, actually, if someone answers this question, that aligns to the senior level, but quite high towards the top of it, because it's almost showing some levels of what the principal might do. And you can't just put pay transparency into a portion of the business. You've got to do it across the board. You've got to go whole hog. So you've basically got to have that progression framework in place, and the bandings costed out, worked on with people partnering and people operations, and done for the whole business. So it's a lot easier to start when you're a lot smaller.
Yeah, I mean, we rolled this out at a previous company that was multiple thousands of people, and especially because we were coming into the US pay transparency laws that were introduced last year, and that forced us to have this conversation at scale, because all of a sudden, not only could any candidate, we had to be able to publish these pay bands, and we wanted to be within like kind of the philosophy of the law, not just the letter of the law. But it also meant that our entire global team had to be analysed, or a US-based team had to be analysed to see all of their compensation levels, how they sit, how do they sit within their own band, how big is the band, why did that person sit in that band? Oh, we've got, turns out there's got this one person who's like really, really out of the band, and therefore we have to adjust you have to bring them up and kind of reconnect all these things. There's like, especially when you're at that multi-thousand person business, there's an enormous amount of work that has to go in just to calibrate internally, let alone before you start to think about the external pieces that layer up onto this, and let alone before you start even doing it by location as well. So, Cleo has multiple offices, I understand now, like you're not just a UK based business, and that will also introduce complexity. Because then you also have the other question, which is really fun, which we get all the time, I'm sure you get as well, is like, well, that person in this country is paid X, but in pounds, that's not the same as mine. Why are they paid more than me if we're doing the same job?
Yeah, and that's a can of worms, isn't it? To answer that one, I think ultimately you see it based on kind of office attendance, the time zone someone needs to be in. Ultimately, if you live in and around London or New York or San Francisco, it costs more money. And so the pay that people get for that isn't necessarily to say that you're better, you deserve more. It's to compensate for where you might need someone to be. If we hired everyone in remote northern Scotland, we'd probably pay less because they don't need the kind of the money for commuting or the house prices in central London, and so on. And again, that's something we're very transparent about. It's not something that I think you'll ever get a group consensus on people being happy with. And to be quite honest, I've always been based in and around London, so it's never something that affects me personally. But as I'm moving kind of further and further out as I get older, I'm sure it will at some point. So probably have to kind of come up with a bit of an opinion there. But yeah, as I said, it's not something that I think will ever necessarily solve for everyone.
Yeah, for sure. And, we've got into, as two recruiters, we've got into some quite kind of meaty compensation philosophy issues. And they are like, I think what I guess we're trying to kind of say through this conversation to candidates listening is that compensation is something that companies do think about with a lot of detail. And there is an insane amount of complexity that goes along with trying to understand like how much someone should get paid. That is happening behind the scenes, and that there are like teams of people and like hundreds of thousands, if not more, dollars spent trying to work out the answer to like how much should we pay people in our company, and how do you balance that tension between the talent that we want to have and the talent that we have within our business, because there's slightly two different ways that those people
definitely.
are also
and you don't want to spend kind of paying new people more and so on. And you're seeing a lot of reward specialists kind of cropping up as a kind of a job career now, kind of splintering off from that kind of more traditional HR or people operations. So it's a career to kind of go in and look at how people are compensated. The money that we pay for tools, for benchmarking, the time that we spend kind of going through that on a kind of annual basis. It's massive. And as you said, I don't think there's a lot of understanding from the market of all this stuff that happens. And what I kind of implore any candidates to do is just ask, if whether a company that you're interviewing with has a transparent salary band or not. I think it's you're well within your rights to say, why are you paying this much for this role, or why do you think that I'm worth this much for this role? As we said earlier, there's no exact science. Everyone's going to have a slightly different answer, but if you've given your time or about to give your time to interview, I think you deserve an answer.
We are delighted to be sponsored by Metaview. Metaview is the AI assistant for the interview process. Their AI records and transcribes hiring conversations like interviews, intakes, and debriefs, and then provides a perfectly summarized note of everything that was discussed. That means that you can focus on creating human connections with candidates during calls and save time on the busy work of cleaning up notes after every interview. I've spoken to so many recruiters and recruiting leaders who are loving using Metaview across their organizations. It's saving them time, but it also means that they have more data to make better decisions. So for every candidate and every pipeline, hiring teams can now make confident and informed decisions, and recruiters can finally take control of the interview process. The impact on candidate experience is also massive. Since recruiters don't have to worry about taking notes in the moment, they can really focus on being present and engaged with you. Forward-thinking recruiters at high-performing organizations like Brex, HelloFresh, and Quora are all leveling up their interviews with Metaview. So head on over to metaview.ai/open to work to get started for free on your first 5 calls. Yeah, for sure. And then so we've talked a lot about compensation, but any rewards person would say, well, hang on a second. There's all these other things that go into making a total package, right? And one of the things we alluded to earlier was equity. And so tell me a bit about what you think candidates need to know about equity, and then maybe talk about how you kind of approach this idea at Cleo.
Yeah, no, great question. And equity is a really interesting one because it's pretty much an even split, I found across my years in recruitment, between people that see that as a be all and end all, because everyone's heard the stories of people that have joined an early stage company and gone out and bought a yacht 5 years later, and some people just don't care. Some people, they want the base salary, they need it for the mortgage, they want the take home pay, and so on. I think but both are completely valid arguments. I think if a company is offering equity, it's great. It's a bonus.
So let's take a step back. Just explaining to the candidate universe who may come interaction with this, when we say equity, what do we mean?
So equity, multiple different kind of forms of equity, depending on which stage of a business you join. Most of the time, if it's a startup or scale up, it will be share options of sorts, unless you're going in super, super senior, where they'll say, here's 8% of the business. But most of the time you'll get share options, which is effectively a guarantee that you can buy the options when they go public, or you can buy the shares once they go public. So you might get £10,000 worth of share options, and then 5 years down the line, the company IPOs, you then buy those options at a much reduced price and then can sell them on straight away and make some money. If it's a public company, you'll get actual shares, typically in the form of RSUs. And this is where they give you shares that will still vest over a couple of years' time, but you might join Google and they'll give you £10,000 of shares, and then 2 years later you can sell them on and make some money. Equity, I think, for bigger companies and for public companies, it's much more tangible and much more kind of part of that total compensation package, because you can typically go on and sell it and you can make money off it. When it comes to options, the potential payout is typically a lot larger, but the risk is also bigger. And the earlier stage you go, the more options you're likely to get, because it's more of a risk that you're taking. But it's a great tool to give everyone a piece of the pie, to make sure people are all pulling in the same direction. Obviously there's the mission of the business, which is always going to be a really important selling point and kind of a tool to bring people together. But also the equity is something that does that as well in equal measure, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's kind of really well articulated. Essentially, when a company is offering you equity, they're offering you a portion of the business, and or at least a promise to, like, in the most simple possible terms. And there's lots of different ways they can do this, lots of different kind of financial infrastructures that exist to do that. But they're saying, hey, here's some of our company, and if this grows in the way that we want it to, here's a way to realize that kind of as a thank you, as a long-term incentive for being successful in that business. And the earlier that you go, and i.e. the more risk that you take. So if you join a company that's 10 people, you're going to get a lot more equity than if you join a company that's 1,000.
Yeah.
And if they're publicly listed, you'll probably get the fewest amount of shares, because there's potentially no risk. The company would deem no risk, but it is an essential part of your package at that stage, because it's worth real money that you can use immediately. I think the real critical thing to discuss is that when you are given this equity, it's not really worth anything. It's worth the paper it's written on, or the digital contract it's written on, until the moment that something happens. And there's a vesting period, which we can talk about a little bit, but then also there's an event has to happen for individuals with shares to be able to realize those shares. So maybe we can talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah, no, of course. So yeah, when you get options or when you get shares, that there'll normally always be some vesting schedule, and this is basically the guard against someone joining a business, getting the shares, and then leaving. So if it's a publicly traded share, then it's normally 2 years, but then they'll do top up, so you'll always be locked in. Is that kind of golden handcuffs that you often get. If it's options, the standard practice is a 4-year vesting schedule. So there's different ways to do it, but effectively every year you work there, you'll get a quarter of those shares vested. So then if the event happens after 1 year, you'll only have a quarter of the shares to sell and so on. As you mentioned, events, the big one's the IPO. So, if you were to join Cleo and get, £50,000 worth of options, and then we were to IPO in 2 years' time, you'd only have 50 or 25,000 of those vested, but then you can sell those on and hopefully they'll be worth a lot more. The other events that can happen, though, is private buyout. So someone can come along and just say, here's a load of money, give me your company. Or a bigger company can come and absorb you in which case they'll agree a share price and they'll pay out the vested shares. Some companies will allow for rapid vesting in this instance, so even your unvested shares might get paid out. The slightly less common event that can kind of benefit people here is just funding rounds. So companies often do it. So if they go through a series funding round, they might be oversubscribed. So they might say to their employees, you can go and sell some of your vested shares now at this share price. So you're not going to make the big amount, but actually if you're quite a risk averse person, you might say, well, bird in the hands, better than two in the bush. I'm going to sell out a proportion of my shares, make some money, and then I might save the rest of them for if we do IPO and then go and buy a boat or something at that point.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing from well-recognized brands of companies, we're starting to see more of these secondary rounds for their employees, and much more, because they realize they can't go public right now, but they also do want to keep their employees incentivized to potentially release some cash into the business as well, and so they're using the employee shares to help release that value, and there's a bunch of different ways. But I think what we're sort of trying to say, I guess, is that it's really important for you to, as a candidate, to understand how this is part of your package, because and we used to say as well, and from my experience, the equity is probably the most negotiable part of your package. And I obviously wouldn't want to speak for Cleo, but I think in my experience of working across a number of different businesses, the equity has been the thing that you can negotiate on much more than the salary, for example. And so just being aware of what it is that you're trying to do, understanding the business, understanding what its pathway towards a public event is, understanding to take that all with a pinch of salt as well. Big pinch of salt. But these are all important parts of your package that you should fully understand and be either excited or not excited about.
Yeah, definitely. And most of the questions that we get here, Cleo, now is, are you profitable? What's the path to profitability? When are you going to IPO? What are the shares worth? And my personal opinion is that it's always a bit of a bonus. You can't expect things to work out in the most perfect way, but even if you get £1 million worth of options, then great, happy days. If you get £1,000 worth of options at the end of it, still £1,000 of free money. So enjoy it for what it is, but unless you're joining very, very early stage or at a very senior level, be realistic about it as well.
I really couldn't agree with that more. I've got friends of mine who are like, yeah, I've got this equity package. It's going to be my big payday. And I'm like, that's never going to happen. Oh. You're absolutely dreaming. You've been sold down. You've been sold a dream there, my friend.
The amount of times I've joined a business and told my wife I've got all this equity, and then we get on Rightmove and just pointing at houses we're going to buy, and it takes a bit of time in the real world to kind of understand it a bit more. But yeah, it's a nice bonus if it happens.
Okay, so Luke, just to round us out, then, what's your kind of quickfire kind of perspective on why a company should implement paid transparency?
I think it starts the relationship in the most honest and open way with a candidate, and it bleeds into your culture from the offset. So from a company's perspective, yes, it's a lot of work to get it set up, but it's absolutely worth it. It allows much more honest and open conversations. It allows for much more pay parity and fairness in the compensation decisions as well. So, I've not seen a downside of it from my time working at Cleo, and other people that I know in the industry that have worked in similar organisations agree in that regard. And as you said, America have released regulation to kind of make it more mandatory. I wouldn't be surprised if that's not on the cards in the UK at some point soon. So, get ahead of the curve. And from a candidate perspective, just ask all you can, If they're not giving you transparency, demand transparency.
And what recommendations would you give to a candidate to kind of make sure they fully understand, the compensation philosophy of their business and how they're going to be paid?
Yeah, as I said, just ask as many questions as you can, and look for real answers too, rather than just kind of the fluffy stuff of, we think this is what you're worth. I think every company will have a band, every company will have a benchmark that they pay. It's a recruiter's job to act as your agent into the business. So, they're there to help you and put your mind at ease. So do research it. Do research what's important to find out, and what's important to you as well. But I'd always just ask as many questions as you can, and make sure that you're getting as good of answers as you can.
Perfect. And if people want to go and see and learn more about Cleo and how you think about your pay at Cleo, where can we go?
So on our website, you can see our progression frameworks online. You can see our pay bands online. They should be on every job ad as well. So that'll tell you a bit more about it. We've done blogs around kind of progression, around pay transparency too. So do check out the blog page. But also, with anything like this, I fully believe that, talent and kind of job searching is a community that needs to be, used. Reach out to me, always happy to kind of talk about what Cleo's done in terms of getting it set up, or in terms of being a candidate and looking for that transparency too. So, everyone's in a very similar boat when it comes to hiring and looking for a job. So yeah, speak to as many people as you can and try and get an idea that way.
Yeah, I think awesome. Well, look, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Really, really appreciate your guidance for hopefully for candidates in navigating what is such an important part of the conversation, right? Like how much you're going to get paid is going to have an impact for the rest of your time in that business and potentially others after that as well. So thank you for that. I think it's a really important conversation to have more transparency about. And speaking of community, we also have our Open to Work community, which is available where we talk about things like pay transparency and we talk about things like compensation and support candidates in negotiation as well. So take a look at opentowork.community for more information about what you can kind of get access to as part of that community. And obviously we're dropping episodes every Wednesday, so stay tuned for the Open to Work podcast and follow us if you'd like to see more. Once again, thanks so much, Luke, for coming on and sharing more about Cleo and the pay transparency philosophy that you've got there and your personal philosophy as well. And I'm sure I'll see you around very soon.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.
Cheers.